This podcast is proudly sponsored by Tank Joet Solicitors. Tank Joet Solicitors is a national high-profile criminal defence law firm based in the heart of central London. The firm was originally established in 2000 and has grown significantly. Tank Joet Solicitors has dealt with hundreds and hundreds of criminal cases, including murders, manslaughter, serious sexual offences, high-value frauds, terrorism, and many more. They have recently acted in some of the most high-profile cases in the UK. The lawyers at Tank Joet have a wealth of experience and pride themselves for providing exceptional client care. Clients' cases are taken seriously, meticulously prepared with a senior lawyer in overall supervision to give the client the best representation that he or she is entitled to. Make sure to engage with Tank Joet if you want the best from the criminal sector by your side. Head on to their website at www.tankjoet.com or reach out to them by emailing them on info@tankjoet.com or call them on 0208 969 7033. Hello and welcome to another episode here at The Latest with Law Simplified. I am your podcast host, Farine Ali, and today we're joined by a very special guest. I am so excited. I'm always excited though, aren't I? Today's guest is a criminal law barrister with some extensive experience of dealing with very serious criminal offences. He has acted in hundreds and hundreds of cases. He joins us today to share some of his most interesting and juiciest cases and to simplify some law. He'll be telling us how mobile phone evidence is used in trials and whether or not we should hand in our mobile phone and the PIN to the mobile phone to the police when requested. Some pretty important stuff, right? So please stay tuned throughout this podcast. I am so honoured, ladies and gentlemen, to present to you Mr. Zayd Ahmed from Mountford Chambers. Hello and welcome to Law Simplified. How are you, Zayd?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much. Thank you so much for joining us, by the way. We're so excited to have you here because we follow you on TikTok and we watch your sort of your days in the life of a barrister. And what you document and show us. So it's so exciting that you've joined us today.
I'm very grateful. Thank you for having me, and I'm glad that I can be here to talk about my experiences as a criminal barrister and try and raise some more awareness about what I do and what the job entails.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. So why don't we get started, Zayd? Why don't you tell our audience why law and why a career at the bar?
So, very good question. I hadn't always wanted to be a lawyer, actually. I actually wanted to become a police officer, a detective. And so when I was at law school, I, in fact, got a job working for the police. And in fact, that's when I realized that that wasn't what I wanted to do. And I wasn't quite sure what to do next. And so I decided to try and embark on some work experience and trying to figure it out, as many people do at university. And that's when I, in fact, came across a case that I witnessed in my local magistrate's court, where I saw a defendant who was kind of being pushed into doing something that he shouldn't have done in terms of the trial process, and I didn't like that, and it made me feel really angst for him and anxious. And so it started from there, really. And then I started to do some research into criminal law. I had already done a criminal module, but I didn't realize how the profession worked, what the job entails. And so I decided to do a mini pupillage. And a mini pupillage, for those that don't know, is when you shadow a barrister. And when I did that, I realized that at that point, that's what I want to do. I want to help those that don't have a voice, those that can't speak for themselves. And typically it's those that are unrepresented. And so that's where the path kind of came from, was that having seen that injustice, I wanted to do something about it. And that became my career, my trajectory to becoming where I am today. So that's my route. in terms of why criminal law, it's the most interesting, and it's the one that, in fact, has the most valuable skill set. So what I mean by that is it changes lives. It really does. And having done the job now for 4 years, I've seen firsthand how what a difference I make in someone's life, and that is something that you don't get in other areas of law. Of course, in corporate or commercial settings, finances or financial interests are what drive those lawyers. Family, of course, is proceedings in terms of seeing children or potentially getting a divorce. But in criminal law, you have someone's life in your hands. You can be the person that changes their fate. You could be the person that stops them from going to prison because of something that they may not have done. And so that's the reason why the criminal law really interested me, and that's why I continue to do the job that I do now and practice as a criminal barrister.
And that's so inspiring, actually, and it perhaps shows that it was meant to be, given that you started off wanting to be a police officer and then actually delved into practicing criminal law. So why don't you tell our audiences, how did it start then? Give us a sort of a brief snapshot of your journey then to the bar, if you will, please.
Oh, of course. My journey was conventional in some ways. I am a first generation, so my parents didn't go to university, and there was a lot of pressure being from an Asian background to go to university and to try and get a degree. So at that point, I was deciding what to do, and I found that I'd done A-level law, so I was quite lucky that my sixth form had that option there. And I also did politics. So my route was going to be the law or politics. So I took both of those courses, and I found the law course far more interesting. And so that's where my interest kind of developed. I did really well. I got the top mark in my year. And from there on, I decided to study law at university. So I went to university, did my LLB, really loved it. Found it very challenging, but I also, whilst I was at university, I took part in mooting and debating and a project called the Innocence Project, which is where students can participate in helping someone who claims they're innocent to try and prove their innocence, and submit documents to the Courts of Appeal or to the the Criminal Cases Review Commission, who look at appeals. So I did that, and I found that really, really interesting. And as I said, I did a mini pupillage with a barrister who, funny enough, I actually co-defended with very recently. So that was very wholesome, from shadowing them as a student and then to be working with them on a case. It came all the way around back around, but that was very wholesome. That was a very wholesome moment. But it was from there. So I did my degree, I did a master's to try and expand my knowledge and my understanding and my expertise in criminal law. And then I embarked on the bar course at BPP in London. So I did that, and then I decided to try and apply for pupillage. I didn't get pupillage first time round, so I decided to work for a number of law firms to try and build my practical knowledge and my practical experiences. And that actually really, really helped, because it gave me an understanding of what the solicitors do and how they work. But it also gave me a very good grounding for how cases are prepared. And I think that's what helped me when I applied for pupillage the second year. And I was fortunate enough to get pupillage the second year because of those experiences that I had litigating and preparing cases. And so I got pupillage, and that was amazing. It was a very long process and a very difficult one in terms of how much work you have to do and prepare. But I got pupillage, and I then managed to get tenancy shortly after. So that's my route. I didn't know anyone who was a lawyer. I didn't know any barristers. Just worked very, very hard, and it takes a lot of hard work and a lot of determination. But if you want to do it, if you want to be a barrister, if you want to do this job, you can. And I think I'm proof of that.
How fascinating. Many congratulations on all your achievements, Ed. It's very inspiring, actually, and very inspiring for students from your ethnic minority groups. And we'll talk about that in a moment, because you're actually involved in that sort of work and you do advocate, more diversity at the bar. So what does your day look like? I mean, we watch your TikToks, and if anybody hasn't already come across Zayd, which I'd be very surprised if that is the case, because it's actually very prominent. Your TikToks are going viral. So do check out Zayd Ahmed on TikTok. The handle, I understand, is @lawyer Zayd. So
Yes.
tell us, what does a normal day look like for you at court?
It is very difficult to explain a normal day, unfortunately. There is no such thing as a normal day. And in fact, my day last week and my day today, very, very different. It really depends on what's in your diary. And I'm quite fortunate enough to have a number of solicitors who support me and give me work. For example, last week, this day last week, I was in a trial. So I just finished a trial where the defendant was charged with Section 20, which is a GBH offence, and he was acquitted. So I had a great week. I was at Snaresbrook Crown Court for 3.5 days, and I was involved in that trial. So my day then would involve getting up, going to court, cross-examining witnesses, taking notes, preparing my closing submissions and my closing speech, looking at the legal directions and issues that come up during the course of the trial. So in that case, there was an issue about bad character, which the Crown were relying on, or they wanted to rely on, and I had to object to that. So there were legal arguments. And then eventually there was my closing speech, which was fortunate enough to led to the jury acquitting my client, who was very, very happy. He'd only just had a baby. There's a lot on the line for him. And he in fact gave me a hug, which is the first time I've had a defendant hug me. So that was last Friday. And then today, a very different day. I was at Isleworth. I dealt with a sentencing hearing for a case involving the supply of drugs. Then I had a plea and trial preparation hearing, which is a first appearance essentially at the Crown Court. A client entered a not guilty plea to a charge, and the trial has been set for next year. And that was at a different court venue in Harrow. And then I had a conference with a client for a trial that I'm starting next week, which is at Isleworth as well. For that trial is a Section 18 trial, which is slightly more serious. It's a stabbing that took place. And I had a conference with a client for 2 hours to prepare him for the trial that is taking place on Monday of next week. So very different days, a lot of traveling. I have to warn people that want to come into the job. There's a lot of traveling around, and there's a lot of cases at the same time. I think people often forget that barristers don't just deal with one case. There's constant cases that we have to go back to assist our solicitors with and prepare at the same time. And so that's a typical day. But of course, it could be more, it could be less.
Yeah.
For example, I had a day a couple of weeks ago where I had 6 cases in one court, and I was back to back in Snaresbrook, just dealing with a number of cases back to back. So those days can happen, but then you can also have days where you only have one case and you have the afternoon off. And I typically go to the gym and I see my friends and stuff. So it really varies. It's not as intense as it sounds, but it can vary depending on what your diary says.
Sounds very intense, actually, Zed. I was just about to say.
I think it's getting more intense, but certainly you have your downtime. There are days when you do get to have a half day and you can catch up on some well-needed rest and some of your hobbies that you get up to. It's not constantly working, but it certainly does feel like it. And I'm sure I didn't say it very well. Because I've had a very busy few weeks.
And can you give us a bit of an insight into the types of cases that you're dealing with at the moment?
Certainly, yes. Yeah. I mean, I've mentioned the case that I'm doing next week. So
yes.
that's a trial that's listed for 5 days at Isleworth. And that case is a Section 18. So it's one down from attempted murder. So it's quite a serious case. And in that case, the client is alleged to have stabbed somebody multiple times. And so, of course, I can't divulge any more than that. But that's one of the cases that I have in my diary. I have quite a few varying cases. I've got quite a few drugs cases, so cases where the Crown suggests that my client is supplying drugs. I have a case coming up where it's alleged that somebody trafficked a person into the country.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. It's ongoing, so I can't talk more about it.
Understood.
The cases that I've done are very similar. So my professional background is that I tend to deal with cases involving drug supply or serious violence. So that includes murder, attempted murder, Section 18s and those alike. So it varies. Barristers typically try everything. They try different areas of crime, but I found that I've specialised in that particular field of serious violence and drug supply, and so those are the cases that I typically am involved and instructed in.
Does anything shock you now when you see a brief, or you see the indictment sheet, which is basically a sheet of the charges that the defendant's been sort of charged with? Anything shock you? You think, whoa, what the hell?
It used to. I have to
Okay.
used to. When you start out, you're not used to seeing the cruels of humanity, and particularly in cases of child sex offences. That still shocks me now. But you also have a job to do.
Sure.
It's as if a doctor was to see a very gross injury, but they wouldn't dwell on it. They would simply try and help. And so I think we have to do the same. We have to put our feelings to one side and try our best to help the defendant. Bearing in mind, a lot of defendants are advised to plead guilty and to try and our job is not to try and get them off, as people tend to think, but it's to try and mitigate or explain away what happened so that their lives aren't ruined by a mistake that they may have made. And so I think it's really important to remember that we're not here just to get people off. We're here to try and explain to the courts why someone did something, and maybe there's something behind it. And more recently, we found that there's been a lot of issues with mental health, and that's having an effect on people, particularly COVID. In fact, COVID had a real impact on some people who were very isolated and alone, and unfortunately resulted in them doing some things that were very, very naughty and silly, something that they would never have done. And so nothing shocks me anymore, but certainly when I started out, it did, and I just have to, not think of it in that way, and just as I need to. This is what I've got. These are my instructions, and what can I do to help?
Thank you for that, for the insight. And you just said something, and I want to just touch on it. You said that you have to take your emotion out of it.
Yes.
I mean, you've also mentioned that you deal with cases such as Section 18. You deal with murders and drug-related cases. Do you think that you can take the emotion out of it, especially when you're dealing with things like murder, and that there are real people that have been impacted? And notwithstanding whether your client is guilty or not, obviously that's something that you have to take out of your mind, and do your best to represent your client. Do you think that is something that you can do, given that you're a human being at the end of the day?
You have to. The first thing the jury will be told is that you have to take your emotion out of it, and it applies the same to barristers who represent the clients. You have to, because you just can't get yourself into a position where your judgment is clouded by your emotions. Things happen. People make mistakes. All sorts of things can get out of control, and you have to. If you want to be a successful barrister, you have to let your emotions leave it at home, leave it when you're not in the courtroom, because that's the same thing that the juries are told. And so it'll be unfair for you to do that if the jury are told not to use their emotions and to look at the evidence. And that's exactly what I would say. Of course, we're human beings, and we may go home and think about what we've heard or what we've looked at, but that's where we leave it, at home, and then we come back to court and do our best for our client.
Sure. Thank you very much for that, Zed. I want to talk about now your involvement when it comes to advocating equality and diversity at the bar. Now, you are the chair of the Young Criminal Bar Association and the elected member of the Bar Council. You represent the needs of young and those from the ethnic minority groups practicing at the bar in England and Wales. And actually, you advocate that as well. You want more people from ethnic minority groups to come to the bar. Can you tell our audiences why you think that is important?
It is so important. And the reason it's just so that there are others like me. When I go into a robing room, when I go into court, I look around and I look like the defendants. I relate more to them than I do to my colleagues who are prosecuting or defending. And that's not right. I mean, it's 2023. We shouldn't be in a position where I'm the only brown face in a courtroom. And I find myself in that position time and time again. And the importance of having representation at court is that people then understand that they can relate to their clients. For example, a lot of my clients are from a Muslim background, and because I am Muslim, I understand their cultural differences. I understand why they wouldn't do something. I understand why they would behave in a certain way, And that's really, really important that we have that at the bar, because of course without it, barristers and judges won't understand where the clients are coming from. And so
Yes.
I'm a very passionate about trying to get more people who look like me, more people of color to come into the profession, so that we can show that we're equally as good and we can do this job. And I think that it's a shame that there aren't enough people doing it already. And I have it's right to say that I've tried since I've been a junior barrister to try and get more people of color, more people from ethnic minorities into the profession, so that when I look around, I can have someone to talk to, and so
Yeah.
clients can be represented properly and people will understand where the clients are coming from. So that's the real importance for me.
Absolutely. And what would you say to students who are aspiring to become barristers, but the fact that there aren't many people that look like them at the bar, and they feel disadvantaged as a result, or sort of demoralized? What would you say to them who are just about making that decision, but actually think, perhaps it's not going to work out because there aren't many people that look like me and I won't have a chance?
I do agree. It can be very discouraging. I found it very discouraging because I didn't know who to turn to if I
Mm.
wanted some advice. For example, I had a case a couple of years ago where it was Eid and I didn't know what to do. I mean, I was in the middle of a trial. Can I ask the judge to have the day off? Or there was no one to turn to try and get that advice. And so what I would say is persevere, because if you're discouraged, that's another person that isn't in the profession, and I can't hold the fort by myself. So
Yes.
persevere, and
Yeah.
things will get better. And the more people that want advice, my platform on LinkedIn, for example, is open. I'm happy to talk to people. All I can say is don't be discouraged and be strong, and have faith in yourself, and know that the more people that come through, the more of a community there will be. And certainly I will do all I can to try and make sure that people feel welcomed when they do come, or when they consider a job in the criminal bar. And hopefully there'll be more faces like mine that you'll see in the coming years, and you'll feel as if more has been done to try and encourage people from our backgrounds to do this job. So I certainly hope so.
Absolutely. And for now, people can actually tune into your TikTok, right? And get to know
Yeah.
what it looks like, your day in the life of a barrister. And I think it's so fascinating. But I have to say, some of the videos, I think, whoa, that's just relentless.
I mean, the idea behind it was exactly that. People, when I speak to friends and family, and people that shadow and come to court, no one has any idea of what actually goes into doing the job. They just think that, as you see on TV, we argue for hours and hours and hours, and then go home and have a nice dinner and a drink or whatever. But no, it's not that way. There's a lot to it, and there's a lot riding on it. And so that was the motivation behind it, to try and get more people to understand what we do, but also get more people interested in that profession, because it's not what you see on TV. It's far more interesting than that, and there's way more to it. You're not constantly in a trial. You could be doing something a bit more nuanced. So, for example, a sentencing hearing where you can make a real difference to someone's life. So that was the purpose behind it, and I'm glad that it's been received in that way.
Thank you so much for that, Zed. We're now going to move on to just talking about some of the cases that you dealt with, really. So can you tell our audiences, now we want all the juices, Zed, we want all the exciting stuff. Can
Sure.
you share some of the cases that you've previously dealt with?
Certainly. As I've said, my background is predominantly serious violence. I am fortunate enough to be a dual qualified duty solicitor, so I've got the experience of litigating and also being the barrister on the case. In terms of litigating, I've litigated murders, and I've been involved in a number of murder cases. The one that most prominently resides in my mind was a case in Croydon. This was a case where the defendant had essentially been released from prison. Sorry, not the defendant, the complainant, the victim. He'd only just come out of prison, and this was gang related, unfortunately. And as he was released, my client, who was alleged to have been the back of a moped, had followed the car that he was in once he'd been released from custody, and it was alleged that he was the person with a firearm, and had shot through the back of the car, and as a result, the complainant died from a head injury. So that case was very fascinating because it was all captured on CCTV, and it was cell site analysis. So they used ANPR data and phone data to try and track where the person came from and where they went back to. And in that case, he was in fact convicted of murder in that matter, because the evidence that the jury was satisfied, it was him on the back of the moped, and he was the one that was involved in the murder, in terms of him being the back passenger with the firearm. So I was involved in that case as one of the litigators. I'm quite junior, so I haven't had the pleasure of being an advocate on a murder trial yet, but I have had the pleasure of being on a very serious Section 18 where a defendant was essentially kidnapped.
Wow.
So in that case, it was alleged that the complainant had been taken into a house and beaten, where he suffered a fractured skull. In that case, my client was acquitted, fortunately in that case, because our case was that whilst that was happening, he wasn't in the room, he wasn't participating. And in fact, it was somebody else who had committed that offence. And that was at Snaresbrook Crown Court, which lasted a number of weeks. And my client was acquitted of that. So that's another example of the type of cases that I've done. I've also done the less serious stuff, which is, in fact, tends to be slightly more interesting in some ways. So I've been involved in a number of cases, including one where there was a theft of a quite expensive watch, a street robbery, essentially, where a watch was snatched off of this gentleman's arm. The watch was valued at £20,000. It was quite expensive watch, and this happened in central London. In that case, the issue was identification, where the Crown's case was that they had sufficient evidence to prove that my client was the defendant. In fact, that case was stopped at half time because of police failures. They hadn't done an ID parade, and they hadn't had any. It was a police officer who had recognised my client, essentially, but it wasn't done properly. And in that case, he was found not guilty as well. So those are some of the examples of the cases that I've done. And I'm continuing to be instructed in similar cases and cases, including the one that I mentioned earlier, where I've got a case at the moment at Portsmouth Crown Court where it's alleged that my client trafficked some people into the country illegally. So an array of different types of offences, but that's what I've been involved in, and certainly it's very interesting, as you can probably tell. It's very interesting and very intriguing to be part of, because you get to see different barristers, how they work, and you can pick up their skills and their speeches. But also, it's really good to see how the police use evidence to try and make the jury satisfied, so that they're sure of guilt. And in fact, in each case that I've seen, it hasn't been that way. There's been flaws, and so it's quite a different experience than to other areas of law where you don't get to see that happening in front of you.
Yeah. And just touching on police flaws, I think that's quite interesting, because I don't think people know that this is something that could essentially result in the case being thrown out, because it's fatal, isn't it, Zed?
Certainly.
So if you find that the police haven't followed the codes of conduct or the PACE, which is what regulates what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do, you can effectively, if you win a legal argument, as I understand it, Section 76 or to that effect, you can actually have the case thrown out because that piece of evidence is no longer reliable, which
Correct.
could be the turning point in the case.
That's right, and that's why it's really important that you have, a barrister, a good barrister, because they can get rid of a case from the start. I mean, I've had quite a lot of successes with making those applications because of my experience working for the police. I'm aware of what they should do, and when they don't, I can exploit that and make an application to exclude that evidence. And usually when you apply to exclude a key piece of evidence, the Crown have to review their case, because of course they have to determine whether it's in the public interest and whether there's sufficient evidence to secure a conviction. And often once that evidence has been excluded, they tend to offer no evidence, or they tend to drop it. But even more than that, if it's in the trial and some key piece of evidence is missing, as such, for example, the robbery case, where there was no first description. So a first description is, of course, the description of the person that's involved. That didn't exist, and so the officer had nothing to go off of other than looking at an image, which he then says that he can identify the individual, which didn't make any sense. And so at that point, you can make the application, and the case can get thrown. Well, the Crown can review their case at that point, or the judge can stop it because of unfairness to the defendant in that particular matter. So it's very important to ensure that you have the right barrister, the right legal team, because those issues and those flaws by the police can be exploited, so that, of course, to ensure that there's fairness, because fairness is what's important in criminal trials, and without that, of course, there wouldn't be no justice. So I agree.
Absolutely. That's so interesting. That is so interesting. So if anybody needs a criminal lawyer, whether that's obviously litigation or whether that's representation, that nearly rhymed, please reach out to Zayd Ahmed, and also Tank Jowett Solicitors, who are our sponsors on this. And you work a lot with Tank Jowett Solicitors, don't you?
I do. They're fantastic. So Tank Jowett Solicitors are a firm based in North London, and they instruct me in quite a number of serious cases. I've got one at the moment where it's alleged that essentially the client had been run over, and he had tried to defend himself, and that's a case of violent disorder. Tank Jowett are routinely involved in serious cases such as murder as well. So yes, it's right to say that if you need any assistance and you're looking for a good lawyer that can look at your case and give you some advice, certainly reach out to Tank Jowett or myself.
Absolutely, that's for sure. And as Zayd already mentioned, you're on LinkedIn, you're on all the social media platforms, even Instagram. So I mean, you can easily drop him a message, and indeed he will respond. Zayd, can I ask you now, once the trial is done, right, the jury's gone in, they're deliberating, they're making their decision, and you're told that they've reached an outcome and they're about to come out and deliver the verdict. How does that feel? Because I tell you, Zayd, I'd probably faint in the moment with worry.
It's a very surreal feeling, because you can be confident yourself in your client's case, but you just don't know. You just don't know where it's going to go. And I always get a very gut feeling in my stomach that I can't seem to sway until they've said their verdict. And so what I tend to do is I don't give any hope to my client. I don't say to them, "Oh, you're going to go home later," or I don't say to them, "Oh, that was terrible. You're going to be convicted." I leave it to the jury, and I try and keep myself busy until that verdict comes. So I dive my head straight into another case, try and do something else, try and keep my mind off of it. And when you hear those words that we've got a verdict, your stomach sinks, and you don't know where it's going to go. For example, the case last week, I really didn't know where that was going to go. And in fact, the prosecutor, before they came in, said, "Oh, well, you've done a good job, but let's not be surprised as to them finding him guilty." And so that kind of plays on your mind, is always, "Oh, did I think too that I hadn't done a good enough job, or could I have done something better?" Hearing that from your opponent is quite. It definitely puts you in a position where you're not sure what's going to happen. And then when they say those magic words, "not guilty," you're relieved, but you're also just very grateful that they've accepted what you've said. I think that's the most important part, is that they have taken your words, they have taken your points, and they've agreed with you. And to have that power to be able to persuade them is a feeling like no other. It's not any other area of law. You'd not get that feeling at all. And yes, so
very true
to see that and to hear that, but then also to look back and hear my client crying because he's got his freedom, and then his wife and child, they're outside of court as well. The feeling is like no other. It makes you realize that this job is not about the money or the type of work. Is about seeing that reaction and that gratefulness that you see, where they vested basically their life in your hands, and you've done an important job for them. Because it doesn't matter whether they're going to prison or not. It changes your life being convicted of a crime. You can't travel to certain countries. You can't get a job in certain industries. You're restricted in terms of obviously where you live in certain cases. I don't know if many people know, but when you apply for a mortgage, they need to know that if you've got a criminal conviction. And sometimes if you do, they may decline you just for that reason alone. I know it's very silly, but it follows you around. And most importantly, it follows you in your career. And so to see that difference, to see that they've got some hope, that their life will turn around and be better. I think that's the reason why I do the job, and I love that feeling. So yes, I agree. No feeling like it, and it's one that makes me continue to do the work again and again and again,
Oh,
despite
wow.
the long days and despite the hours that you put in and despite the low pay. Certainly, that makes it all worth it.
All worth it. Yeah. Wow, Zed, that was so powerful, by the way. I felt like that was a closing speech then.
That might be why the jury always come back and say not
Oh,
guilty.
wow.
Yeah.
That was powerful, actually, when you said that they literally, they hand you their life and they trust you with it.
Yeah,
And that's so powerful. So just now, on the rare occasion, I've seen some of the work you've been doing, by the way. Mountford Chambers website is full of updates about all the great results that you've been achieving. But on the very, very rare occasion where you have a guilty verdict, how does that feel?
I've had two cases recently where the jury returned a verdict of guilty, and I wasn't surprised. So I find that justice was done in those cases because it's a result that didn't surprise me, albeit, of course, I would have hoped for an alternative outcome. I think there are some cases when you look at them and you just take a step back and forget your instructions, forget what your client said, just look at the case and think, well, what would you think without having heard or listened to your client's instructions? And in those cases, I saw them coming, if I can put it that way. It's not a nice feeling because, of course, you've put all your hard work. I prepared my cases quite thoroughly, and my cross examinations are normally very, very good, and it's full of flaws or issues that have been arisen. So it's not a nice feeling to go through all of that work and prep to then be, to not get the desired outcome. But I do find that typically justice is done in those cases because, of course, I'm not hugely surprised. I've never had a case where it's been a shock to me that they've been found guilty, if I can put it that way.
Wow.
So I haven't had that experience. I think maybe some other counsel have, but I've not had that experience where I thought my client was genuinely innocent and they were found guilty. I've not had that, so I wouldn't be able to say at this juncture. But certainly, in other cases, it could have gone either way, and it didn't go my way. And of course, that's the role of the jury. They all considered it for hours and hours and hours, and they reached that verdict. So I don't take it personally. I just get on with the next one and try and comfort them as much as I can in terms of what happens next.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Zed. I'm very grateful for that. So, as I mentioned, all of the cases that Zed has been dealing with and all the great results that Zed has achieved, they are all on Mountford Chambers' website. I want to talk about some law now. Very finally. So, just about how the police use the evidence from a mobile phone. So I think this is something that has developed over time and evolved. Sorry, because obviously the phones are so much more advanced now than they were in the olden days. Can you give us a very brief snapshot into how mobile phone evidence is used and how the police can actually access it in any event, given that it's smartphones?
Sure. So there are a number of methods and techniques that the police have to get into a phone. So the most common is, of course, they'll ask you for a PIN number. And this is really important. When an officer asks you for a PIN number, you don't have to give it. And if you don't give it, they can't do anything about that. So what I mean by that is some officers threaten arrest or obstruction, they call it, if you don't give the PIN number. Ignore that because there's no grounds for the officer to say that. And in fact, it's not allowed. They're not allowed to do that. So by giving your PIN number over, what happens is the police download your phone on something called an XRY or a Cellbrite machine. So that's a little device where one end goes into a computer and the other end goes into your phone, and it downloads the contents of your phone. And when the PIN number is available, it's unrestricted. So they can download everything that's on your phone, including pictures, videos, your GPS data, your text messages, anything that's on the phone, they'll be able to copy onto a computer, to a hard drive. So that's one way. Another way which they get it over, they get access to it, is without the PIN number. And they can send it to a particular division. Now, I'm talking about the Met Police here because I don't do many cases outside of London, but the Met Police have got a division within the police that deals with digital technology, and they can get into your phone. So an Android is very easy to get into. An iPhone is slightly more difficult, but it is possible. And what they do is they send it off, and they have another device similar to that Cellbrite machine, but another device which tries to guess the passwords. And then eventually what happens is it will find the password, and then they can get into it. And once again, they can get all of the data off the phone, and the same way as I've already explained. The other way that the police can get access to your phone is through what we call a RIPA order. So a RIPA is a power that police have, and it's essentially is if you fail to give the PIN number, you commit an offence, and that has to be approved by the court. So a court has to issue the RIPA order, and if you don't give the PIN number over, you'll be committing a separate offence. So that typically makes people, or changes their view on it, and they give the PIN numbers over. So those are the three ways. And what the police do with that evidence is it varies. They can look at your text messages. So, for example, in cases of drug supply, they'll very often look at text messages and call data to see how often that phone's being used, and what type of text messages are coming through. Bearing in mind, iMessages are included in that. So iMessages aren't deleted, as people tend to think, and WhatsApps are also included. So, albeit WhatsApp is a secure app, when they have the device, it's not secure because they have the actual device where the messages are. So they can't access that information from the cloud, but they can if they've got your device to hand with the PIN numbers. So that's what they typically do. They also can go through pictures. So I've had drugs cases where they found deleted images of drugs or weapons, etc. And more and more, you're finding that the police are actually using the GPS data. So that's in cases where, for example, the murder case that I was involved in, and the Section 18, they used the GPS data to track the whereabouts of where the defendant was going and coming, to show that at the time of the offence, he was in the vicinity where the incident took place. And so they can use GPS data in that way. They can also use GPS data without having the handset, as long as they've got the mobile number, by obtaining the subscription information from the service provider. So they have got a number of tools at their disposal. That evidence has to be requested. So when your case, if you've got a case where there is evidence, your solicitor and your barrister will of course ask for that disclosure, so that you could be advised on what's on the phones, and how damning the evidence is, or if the evidence supports your case, and it will also be disclosed in that regard as well. But the phones, unfortunately, are being used more and more to try and convict defendants of offences, because of course everyone uses their phone every minute of every day, and so there's a wealth of data on the handset. One thing I've done in cases is in fact use that to help us. So for example, when you take a photograph, there are GPS locations or tags in the information of that photograph. And so I was able to, in a case not too long ago, show that the defendant wasn't at the area because he took a photograph which placed him somewhere else. And so we, as your barristers and your defense lawyers, can also use that information to assist us. So it isn't just one way, but certainly the police are more and more using your phones to try and prove their case. And that's what's causing delays to some people. So some people may be on bail for a number of months or years. The reason for that is because, of course, their phones are being downloaded in one way or the other, and so that causes delays when it comes to bringing the charges, which the police will obviously lay once they've got that evidence. So hopefully that helps everyone understand how important it is that you get advice. Firstly, if you're arrested, always ask for a solicitor. Solicitors don't work for the police. That's a myth. I don't know who brands this myth around, but always ask for a solicitor, because they will be able to advise you on whether to give your PIN codes or not, and they can advise you on the RIPA order, as I've already explained.
Thank you so much for that, Zayd. So Zayd, just one last question about phones. So there are these, burner phones that you can buy. How true is it that the police can't get into those? I mean, in movies, you see people buying burner phones, throwing them away, and then getting another. Is it right and true that the police can't actually access the data on those?
It's more difficult when it's not registered. That's correct. However, the police do have tools at their disposal. For example, if you're found with a burner phone, that makes it a lot easier for them to identify the number, and then obviously from there they can get the subscriber information. So your phone provider they store all of your calls and your text messages, so that can be obtained from them, even if there's nothing on the phone. If you don't have the phone or the burner phone, what the police tend to do is they tend to look in the area. So each area has a mast, and they can try and pin down the number of a phone by the area it's in. So, for example, if it's within reach of your normal phone, they can try and work out whether that phone is in tandem with the burner phone. People typically carry both at the same time if they're involved in criminality, and so they can use that to determine or find out the number, and then once again obtain that information from the service provider. So it is possible. However, it is more difficult because, of course, they don't know the number, they don't know who's registered to it. If you are, however, topping up the phone, if it's an unregistered pay-as-you-go, they can find the details, because, of course, they can see where you purchased it from, and they can get that information from the place where you purchased the top-up voucher. So they can do that as well. So be wary. It's not right to say that you can't get into it. In fact, burner phones, once the police have them, are probably one of the easiest phones to get into. iPhones and Androids, they've got software on them that stops it from being opened or hacked. Burner phones, unfortunately, don't have that, so they're very easy to get into if the police have possession of those phones.
Great, thank you so much for that. That's very helpful. By the way, I have an Android. I think I now need to move on to an Apple, although I'm not sure why the police might want to get into mine. Apart from law videos and content, there's nothing more, on my phones, but there you go. Thank you so much for that, Zayd, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's been so fascinating to hear about not only your journey to the bar, but your experiences in court and some of the cases that you're either dealing with or you've dealt with. Can I ask you for, very lastly, your closing remarks for aspiring barristers, for professionals and the general public, please?
What I would say is this: if you are an aspiring barrister, please think about whether this is the right career for you, but also just go for it. I mean, you have to work hard, but it's a job that is very rewarding. It's a job where you can see the change that you're making just by your words, and it's a job where you will not feel you'll feel so rewarded just by looking at someone's face. And so all I can say is that if this is a job where you want to help people, where you want to use your legal skills, you want to be able to test evidence, and you want to be able to argue it in front of a jury, then come to the criminal bar. And there'll be more faces like me, hopefully in the near distant future. And it's very welcoming. We will welcome you. And so just persevere, try hard, and fingers crossed I'll see you on the other side.
Oh, that's amazing. We can't wait. So thank you so much for that. And thank you so much again for joining us. It's been absolutely wonderful to have you here and to hear from you. So much I learned, and it's so engaging, actually. I do love crime, or hearing about it, obviously. Nice. I don't think I have the nerve to practice crime, to be honest. But yeah, it's really fascinating. So thank you again.
No, I'm very grateful, and I'm happy to be speaking about my experience. And thank you for making the time to speak to me today. Thank you.
Thank you. There we have it, Mr. Zayd Ahmed from Mountford Chambers. Please do follow Zayd on all the social media platforms, including TikTok, where he shares his day in the life of a barrister. And I tell you, it's pretty interesting stuff. Do also follow Law Simplified on all the social media platforms, including TikTok. And do head on to our website at www.law-simplified.co.uk to check out our resources. I want to say a huge thank you to our sponsors again, Tank Joat Solicitors. Please do make sure to head on to their website at www.tankjoat.com and remember to engage their lawyers whenever you need the best in criminal law by your side. Do also follow them on all the social media platforms as well. Thank you so much for tuning in. It's been an absolute pleasure. Please subscribe to this channel. Do head on to our TikTok and make sure to please follow us so that we can always keep you in contact with the law. Until I see you on the next one, thank you so much again. Take care and goodbye.